Funny how people trust a badge faster than they trust the truth. The rain came down hard over the east side of Baltimore, turning the cracked sidewalks silver beneath the flashing red and blue lights. Naomi Carter stood beside her faded blue Chevy Malibu with both hands visible, her breathing calm even as half the neighborhood stared from apartment windows and front porches. Officer Ryan Keller moved toward her slowly, one hand resting near his holster, the other gripping a clear evidence bag like he had already decided the ending to the story. "Step away from the vehicle," he barked loud enough for everyone to hear. Naomi obeyed without arguing. Water dripped from the sleeve of her gray hoodie as she stepped backward onto the wet pavement. Around them, phones were already out. A teenager across the street whispered, "Yo, they got another one." Keller glanced toward the crowd and straightened his posture like he enjoyed the attention. "Ma'am, we received a narcotics tip connected to this vehicle." Naomi looked directly at him for the first time. Her expression never changed. No panic, no anger, just quiet focus. "Then you should search it carefully," she said softly. That answer seemed to irritate him more than fear would have. Detective Mason Briggs circled around the back of the Malibu, pretending to inspect the trunk while rainwater rolled off the shoulders of his leather jacket. The neighborhood had seen scenes like this before. Black suspects, white officers, loud accusations before evidence ever appeared. Most people stopped asking questions years ago. But Naomi noticed everything. The angle of Keller's body camera, the way Briggs avoided eye contact, the nervous twitch in the detective's jaw every time lightning flashed overhead. A little boy standing under a laundromat awning held up his phone, live streaming the entire stop to barely 30 viewers. "This is crazy," he whispered into the screen. "They really pulled this lady over." Keller suddenly reached into the back seat through the open car door. A second later, he lifted a plastic bag filled with white powder high into the air like a trophy. "There it is," he announced. Several people gasped. Someone cursed under their breath. Briggs let out a low whistle and shook his head with fake disappointment. "Looks like our tip checked out." The rain hammered harder against the pavement now, bouncing off police cruisers and soaking through Naomi's sneakers. Still, she didn't react the way Keller expected. No screaming, no pleading, no breakdown. She simply stared at the evidence bag for 3 long seconds before lifting her eyes back to his. "You logged that already?" she asked calmly. Keller frowned. "What?" "The chain of custody," Naomi replied. "Did you log it before removing it from the vehicle?" For the first time, something flickered across Briggs' face. Small, fast, uneasy. Keller stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think you're smarter than us?" Naomi's gaze never moved. "No," she said quietly. "I think you're getting careless." Thunder rolled above the neighborhood like distant artillery. Somewhere nearby, a baby started crying through an open apartment window. The live-stream kid zoomed closer with shaky hands as Keller snapped handcuffs around Naomi's wrists. "Another dealer off the streets," he announced proudly to the cameras gathering at the corner. But as he guided her toward the squad car, Naomi glanced once toward the detective beside him. And for the first time that night, Mason Briggs looked afraid. The holding room smelled like old coffee, bleach, and rain-soaked fabric. Naomi Carter sat alone beneath a buzzing fluorescent light with her cuffed hands resting calmly in her lap, while water from her hoodie slowly dripped onto the concrete floor beneath the metal chair. Somewhere deeper inside the precinct, a printer kept spitting out paperwork in uneven bursts. Officers laughed at something down the hallway. A television mounted near the ceiling played the late-night news with the volume low, already showing blurry footage of her arrest beneath the words "suspected narcotics trafficking." Naomi lifted her eyes toward the screen for only a moment before looking away again. The officer outside the holding room glanced at her through the narrow glass window and frowned. Most suspects yelled. Most cried. Some begged to make a phone call before booking. Naomi had done none of those things. She had only asked once to preserve every second of body camera footage and once to document who physically handled the evidence bag. That was it. Quiet questions. Calm voice. The kind of calm that made nervous people even more nervous. Upstairs on the second floor, Ryan Keller loosened his tie and poured stale coffee into a paper cup, while Detective Mason Briggs stood near the blinds watching rain slide down the precinct windows. "You saw the way she looked at us," Briggs muttered. Keller scoffed without turning around. "She is scared." "No," Briggs replied softly. That did not look like fear. Keller finally looked up. The overhead lights cast hard shadows across his face, sharpening the lines around his jaw. You are overthinking this. Briggs rubbed both hands over his face. She knew about chain of custody before we even booked her. So what? Keller snapped. Maybe she watches crime shows. But even he did not sound convinced anymore. Downstairs, Naomi leaned back against the cold wall and closed her eyes for a moment as footsteps approached the holding room. A young desk officer stopped outside the bars carrying a clipboard and a foam cup of water. He looked barely old enough to shave. You need anything? He asked awkwardly. Naomi opened her eyes slowly. What is your name, officer? Ethan Morales. How long have you been on the force, Ethan? 8 months. Naomi nodded once like she had expected that answer. Then here is some advice. Always keep copies of original reports. The young officer blinked in confusion. What? People panic when investigations start closing in, Naomi said quietly. And when they panic, paperwork changes. Before Ethan could answer, Keller appeared at the end of the hallway. Morales, he barked sharply. Move. The rookie immediately stepped aside. Keller stared at Naomi through the bars for several seconds. Rainwater still glistened on the shoulders of his dark uniform. You think you are going to walk out of here? He asked coldly. Naomi tilted her head slightly. I think you already know this arrest was a mistake. Keller smiled without warmth. Funny thing about mistakes. Once the media gets hold of them, they become facts. Naomi studied him carefully now, almost the way a doctor studies symptoms before delivering bad news. You should stop talking on unsecured phones, she said softly. The smile disappeared from Keller's face instantly. Silence settled over the hallway. Even the rookie officer looked confused now. Keller stepped closer to the bars. What did you say? Naomi lowered her voice until it barely rose above the hum of fluorescent lights. A man who thinks nobody is listening usually says too much. Keller stared at her for a long moment before turning away fast enough to hide the flicker of concern crossing his eyes. But upstairs near the rain-streaked windows, Detective Briggs had already started wondering whether the woman downstairs had planned for this night long before any of them realized. By sunrise the storm had passed, but the city still looked washed in cold gray light as news vans lined the curb outside the Baltimore Central Courthouse. Reporters stood beneath umbrellas rehearsing dramatic headlines while camera crews adjusted cables across wet concrete steps. Naomi Carter stepped out of the transport vehicle in county jail clothing with her wrists restrained in front of her, and every camera immediately turned toward her face. Flashbulbs exploded across the morning air. Naomi, did you traffic narcotics across state lines? Who are you working for? Did police find over 2 pounds of cocaine in your vehicle? She answered none of them. Her expression stayed unreadable as marshals guided her through the courthouse doors beneath the giant bronze seal mounted over the entrance. Inside, the building smelled faintly of polished wood, old paper, and coffee that had been sitting too long on a warmer. Lawyers hurried through marble hallways carrying folders thick enough to ruin lives. Somewhere in the distance a bailiff shouted courtroom numbers over the echo of footsteps. Naomi was placed inside a small waiting room beside courtroom 7 while officers prepared the hearing. A wall clock ticked loudly above her head. Every second sounded deliberate. Outside the room, Ryan Keller adjusted his tie-in. The reflection of a courthouse window while Assistant District Attorney Charles Bennett reviewed printed evidence photos. Open and shut, Bennett muttered confidently. The jury pool is going to eat this up. Keller nodded, but his eyes looked tired. He had barely slept. Naomi's words from the night before kept replaying in his head like a song he could not turn off. A man who thinks nobody is listening usually says too much. Detective Briggs stood farther down the hallway pretending to scroll through his phone while sweat darkened the collar of his shirt despite the cool morning air. We should have waited, Briggs said quietly once Bennett walked away. Keller's jaw tightened instantly. Too late now. I am serious, Ryan. Something about her is wrong. Keller grabbed his arm hard enough to stop him mid-sentence. Listen to me carefully. We planted the evidence. We wrote the reports. We stick to the story. Briggs glanced toward the courtroom doors where reporters were gathering. And if she already knows? Keller stared at him for a long moment before releasing his grip. Then she should have spoken sooner. Inside the waiting room, Naomi sat perfectly still beneath the hum of fluorescent lights. A public defender she had never met before rushed in carrying a wrinkled legal pad and an overstuffed briefcase. Miss Carter, I am Daniel Reeves. I have reviewed what little they gave us. He lowered his voice immediately. This does not look good. Naomi looked up calmly. Did they provide the original body camera files? Reeves blinked. No. Just edited copies attached to the report. Naomi nodded once like she expected that answer. Then asked for metadata authentication before arraignment. The attorney frowned in confusion. Most defendants do not even know what metadata is. Naomi folded her hands slowly. Most defendants are not paying attention. Outside, the courtroom doors finally opened. Reporters rushed inside as spectators filled wooden benches hoping for another scandal to gossip about over dinner. The seal of the state of Maryland hung high behind the judge's bench beneath warm golden lights. Keller took his seat near the prosecution table and loosened his stiff collar slightly. Across the room, Briggs kept glancing toward Naomi as deputies escorted her inside. But what unsettled him most was not her silence. It was the fact that she looked almost relieved to finally be there. The courtroom felt warmer once it filled with people, but the tension inside it carried a colder kind of weight. Wooden benches creaked beneath reporters leaning forward with notebooks ready while courthouse lights reflected softly against polished oak walls. Naomi Carter sat beside her public defender with both hands folded neatly on the table, her posture calm enough to unsettle anyone paying close attention. Across the aisle, Ryan Keller avoided looking directly at her now. Instead, he focused on the prosecutor standing before Judge Eleanor Whitmore, presenting photographs of evidence bags and printed reports with polished confidence. The defendant knowingly transported illegal narcotics across county lines, Assistant District Attorney Bennett declared as enlarged images flashed across the courtroom monitors. Officers discovered over 2 pounds of cocaine hidden inside her vehicle during a lawful stop. Murmurs spread quietly through the gallery. A woman near the back shook her head in disappointment, while another whispered something about crime getting worse every year. Naomi remained motionless through all of it. Judge Whitmore adjusted her glasses and looked toward the defense table. Miss Carter, how do you plead? The room went silent enough to hear the faint hum of the ceiling vents overhead. Naomi slowly rose to her feet. Not guilty, Your Honor. Her voice was steady, soft, controlled. Bennett immediately stepped forward again. Your Honor, given the seriousness of the charges and the amount of narcotics recovered, the state requests no bail pending further investigation. Keller nodded subtly from the prosecution table as cameras from local news stations zoomed tighter onto Naomi's face. But before Judge Whitmore could respond, Naomi spoke again. I would also like the court to preserve all original digital evidence immediately. Bennett frowned. Excuse me. Naomi turned slightly toward the judge. Original body camera footage, dash camera archives, dispatch audio, evidence locker logs, full metadata records. The prosecutor blinked in visible confusion while several reporters began scribbling faster. Judge Whitmore leaned back slightly in her chair. Miss Carter, are you trained in digital forensics? Naomi hesitated for half a second. I understand chain of evidence procedures, Your Honor. Across the room, Detective Briggs lowered his eyes toward the floor. Keller's jaw tightened again. Bennett attempted a laugh that sounded forced. Your Honor, the defendant appears to have watched too many police dramas. A few people chuckled softly in the gallery. Naomi did not react. Judge Whitmore tapped her pen thoughtfully against the bench. The request is noted. Then she looked toward the prosecution. Can the state provide original unedited footage? Keller finally spoke for the first time that morning. There was minor corruption in the upload process, Your Honor. Standard compression issues. Naomi's eyes lifted toward him immediately. Not angry, not surprised, just observant. Compression does not alter timestamps, she said quietly. The courtroom fell still again. Briggs slowly rubbed a hand over the back of his neck, while sweat gathered near his collar despite the cool air conditioning. Bennett quickly interrupted before the silence became dangerous. Your Honor, the defendant is attempting to distract from overwhelming evidence. Judge Whitmore studied Naomi carefully now, almost like she was trying to solve a puzzle no one else noticed yet. Miss Carter, the judge asked slowly, is there something specific you believe this court should know? Naomi looked toward the courtroom windows where pale afternoon sunlight filtered through the glass in narrow golden beams. For the first time all day, a faint expression crossed her face. Not fear, not confidence either. Something closer to patience. Not yet, Your Honor, she answered softly. But there will be. Keller's fingers tightened around the edge of the prosecution table hard enough for his knuckles to pale beneath the courtroom lights, while somewhere, behind him, Detective Briggs finally realized the woman they arrested might not have been trapped inside this courtroom at all. The afternoon light had faded by the time the prosecution called Ryan Keller to the witness stand, leaving the courtroom washed in the pale amber glow of overhead fixtures that hummed softly above the crowded gallery. Rain tapped lightly against the tall courthouse windows again, quieter now, almost patient. Keller adjusted his uniform before taking his oath, his polished badge catching the light as reporters leaned forward with renewed attention. This was the moment the state wanted. The decorated officer. The calm testimony. The final nail in Naomi Carter's public image. Assistant District Attorney Bennett approached with practiced confidence. "Officer Keller, describe what happened during the traffic stop." Keller folded his hands carefully. "We received an anonymous narcotics tip regarding the defendant's vehicle. Upon conducting a lawful search, I discovered a controlled substance package inside the rear passenger compartment." Bennett nodded. "And how did the defendant behave during the arrest?" Keller glanced briefly toward Naomi before answering. "Unusually calm." A few people in the gallery shifted quietly at that answer. Bennett continued pacing slowly before the jury section. "In your professional opinion, did the defendant appear familiar with narcotics procedures?" "Yes," Keller replied immediately. "Extremely familiar." Bennett stopped walking and turned dramatically toward the courtroom. No further questions. Cameras clicked softly from the media section while Judge Whitmore looked toward the defense table. "Mr. Reeves?" Naomi's public defender rose uncertainly, flipping through notes that suddenly looked too thin for the weight of the room. "Officer Keller," he began awkwardly. "You stated the evidence was recovered directly from the vehicle?" "Correct. And only you handled the discovery?" "Yes." Naomi slowly lifted her eyes toward Keller now. The room felt smaller somehow. Tighter. Reeves swallowed hard. "Did anyone else touch the package prior to processing?" "No," Keller answered without hesitation. "Absolutely not." Naomi closed her eyes briefly at those words, almost disappointed. Reeves looked lost for a moment before sitting back down too quickly, defeated by the confidence on the witness stand. Bennett smiled faintly while reporters scribbled fresh headlines onto legal pads. "Guilty woman cornered." "Experienced officer credible." "Case nearly closed." But across the courtroom, Detective Briggs looked physically ill now. His knee bounced beneath the table. Sweat dampened the edges of his collar again. He kept replaying the previous night in his mind. Keller lifting the bag from his own jacket. Keller saying nobody would question them. Keller forgetting the live stream kid standing under the laundromat awning. Judge Whitmore glanced toward Naomi again. "Miss Carter, do you wish to address the court?" The entire room shifted toward her instantly. Naomi stood slowly, smoothing the sleeves of her county-issued clothing with calm, deliberate movements. "Just one question for Officer Keller, Your Honor." Bennett immediately objected. The defendant is not representing herself. But Judge Whitmore raised a hand gently. "I will allow one question." Silence settled across the courtroom so completely that even the rain outside seemed to pause. Naomi looked directly at Keller for the first time since proceedings began. "Officer," she said softly, "what time did you activate your body camera?" Keller blinked once. "Approximately 9:14 p.m. "And what time did dispatch first report my vehicle?" 9:12. Naomi nodded faintly. "So you activated your camera after approaching the car?" Keller hesitated for the first time all day. Just 1 second. Barely noticeable. But Detective Briggs saw it immediately. Judge Whitmore saw it too. Naomi's voice stayed calm. "Interesting." Bennett rose quickly again. "Your Honor, this line of questioning is irrelevant." But before the judge could answer, the courtroom doors suddenly opened at the back with a sharp metallic echo that cut through the silence like a blade. Every head turned at once. And when Keller looked toward the entrance, the color drained slowly from his face. The sound of the courtroom doors opening echoed across the chamber like a crack through ice. Every conversation stopped instantly. Reporters lowered their pens. Even the rain outside seemed distant now beneath the sudden silence pressing against the room. 3 people entered together wearing dark federal jackets marked with small gold lettering near the chest. Their shoes clicked steadily against the marble floor as they moved down the center aisle without hesitation. Ryan Keller felt his stomach tighten before he even saw the credentials. Detective Briggs looked like he had stopped breathing altogether. At the front of the group walked an older black man with silver at his temples and a leather folder tucked beneath one arm. Calm. Precise. The kind of presence that did not need to announce authority because authority already followed him into the room. Judge Whitmore straightened slightly in her chair. "Can I help you?" The man reached the front rail and opened the leather folder slowly. Samuel Hayes, Drug Enforcement Administration. The courtroom exploded into whispers immediately. Reporters leaned toward one another while courthouse deputies exchanged confused glances. Bennett rose quickly from the prosecution table. "Your Honor, what exactly is the meaning of this interruption?" Hayes never looked at him. His eyes remained fixed on Keller. "The meaning," he said evenly, "is that this proceeding has entered federal jurisdiction." The room went still again. Naomi remained seated at the defense table with her hands folded quietly in front of her, almost untouched by the chaos building around her. Keller forced a laugh that sounded dry and unnatural. "Federal jurisdiction?" he repeated. "Over a local narcotics arrest." Samuel Hayes finally turned toward him fully. "Yes, Officer Keller. Especially when the narcotics were planted during an active, undercover operation." The words landed heavily inside the courtroom. A woman near the back gasped aloud. Someone dropped a pen. Detective Briggs lowered his head immediately like the strength had gone out of his spine. Bennett stared between Keller and Hayes with growing confusion. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "I was never informed of any federal involvement." "That is because very few people were," Hayes replied. He then looked toward Naomi. For the first time, their eyes met briefly. Professional. Silent. Familiar. Naomi gave the smallest nod. Nothing more. Judge Whitmore leaned forward slowly. "Are you telling this court the defendant is federal law enforcement?" Samuel Hayes removed another document from the folder and handed it directly to the bailiff. "Special Agent Naomi Carter. Deep cover assignment. 11-month operation targeting police corruption and narcotics diversion inside Baltimore Metro." The bailiff passed the credentials upward to the judge while whispers spread through the gallery like wildfire. Cameras clicked nonstop now. Keller's face had gone pale beneath the courtroom lights. "That is impossible," he muttered. "No," Briggs whispered from behind him, barely audible. "It is not." Hayes continued calmly. "Agent Carter requested continued surveillance despite repeated safety concerns because she believed certain officers were falsifying arrests and redirecting confiscated narcotics back into circulation." Keller suddenly stood. "This is insane." "Sit down," Judge Whitmore snapped sharply. For the first time all day, Keller obeyed without argument. Naomi slowly rose from her seat now. The courtroom watched her differently this time. Not as a suspect. Not as another black woman trapped inside a broken system. The entire room seemed unsure what she truly was anymore. Her county-issued clothing suddenly looked strange against the calm authority in her posture. Samuel Hayes turned toward her slightly. "Agent Carter," he said quietly, "did the operation conclude successfully?" Naomi looked directly at Ryan Keller before answering. Her voice remained soft enough that everyone leaned forward to hear it. "Not yet." Then she glanced toward the courtroom monitors mounted near the jury box. "But it will in a few minutes once they play the unedited footage." The courtroom monitors flickered softly as a federal technician connected a secure drive beneath the judge's bench. Nobody spoke now. The earlier whispers had disappeared completely, replaced by the kind of silence that only comes when people realize they may have judged the wrong person too quickly. Rain continued sliding down the courthouse windows in slow silver lines while Naomi Carter stood quietly beside the defense table, no longer looking like someone waiting to be rescued. Ryan Keller remained frozen in his chair, his fingers clenched tightly together while Detective Briggs stared at the floor like he could already see his career collapsing beneath him. Judge Whitmore adjusted her glasses once more. "Play the footage." The screen turned black for half a second before grainy body camera video appeared across the courtroom monitors. Timestamp numbers glowed white in the corner. 9:11 p.m. Not 9:14. A low murmur spread instantly through the gallery. Bennett leaned forward sharply. That timestamp was not included in the state evidence package. Samuel Hayes folded his arms calmly. Because the state evidence package was edited. On screen, Keller's patrol car rolled slowly toward Naomi's parked Malibu beneath flashing emergency lights. The rain looked heavier in the original footage. Harsher. The audio crackled with static and dispatch chatter. Then Keller's voice came through clearly. "Camera on." Briggs answered from somewhere off-screen. "Yeah. You good?" The room stayed completely still. On the monitor, Keller approached the vehicle, but before speaking to Naomi, he reached into the inside pocket of his own rain jacket. A clear plastic package appeared briefly in his hand before disappearing below camera level near the rear passenger door. Several people gasped aloud inside the courtroom. A reporter near the front actually lowered her notebook in shock. Bennett slowly removed his glasses, his face draining of color. Judge Whitmore stared at the screen without blinking. Keller shifted suddenly in his chair. "This footage is incomplete," he snapped. "It does not prove anything." But nobody looked at him anymore. The video continued playing. Naomi stepped out of the vehicle exactly as she had that night. Calm, careful, observant. Then her voice emerged through the courtroom speakers, soft but unmistakably steady beneath the rain. "Then you should search it carefully." Briggs closed his eyes briefly at the sound of it. He remembered that moment now with painful clarity. The warning hidden inside her words. The chance they had to stop before everything collapsed. But Keller had never been the kind of man who recognized warnings unless they threatened him personally. The footage moved forward another 30 seconds before Keller lifted the planted narcotics into view for the cameras. "There it is," he announced proudly on screen. Then another voice unexpectedly entered the audio feed. "Young. Nervous. Yo, they got another one. The livestream kid." Samuel Hayes glanced toward the courtroom doors where a teenage boy now stood beside two federal agents clutching his phone tightly in both hands. The same boy from the laundromat awning. Keller saw him too, and for the first time genuine fear crossed his face openly. Hayes spoke quietly. The live stream archived automatically to cloud storage before local officers confiscated the device. Briggs finally stood up, trembling slightly. "I want legal counsel," he muttered. Keller turned toward him instantly. "Sit down." But Briggs shook his head slowly. No, his voice cracked under the weight of exhaustion and panic. "No more lies." Every camera in the courtroom swung toward him. Briggs looked toward Naomi with shame heavy in his expression. "She tried to stop it," he admitted quietly. "She warned us." Naomi said nothing. She only watched him with the same calm stillness she had carried since the beginning. The stillness of someone who never needed revenge because the truth was already doing all the work for her. The courtroom no longer sounded like a criminal hearing. It sounded like something breaking apart in real time. Reporters spoke over one another while courthouse deputies moved toward Ryan Keller with cautious uncertainty, waiting for instructions that nobody seemed prepared to give. Judge Whitmore struck her gavel twice, the sharp cracks echoing across the chamber before silence slowly returned. "Order," she commanded firmly. "This court will have order." But the atmosphere had already changed completely. Only an hour earlier, Naomi Carter had entered the courtroom in restraints while cameras painted her as another headline destined to disappear beneath the weight of public judgment. Now every eye followed her with a different kind of attention. Some looked ashamed. Others looked stunned. A few simply looked confused by how quickly certainty could collapse once truth entered the room. Keller remained seated at the prosecution table, staring at the paused footage frozen across the monitors. His own image glared back at him from the screen beside the planted evidence bag. The reflection of flashing patrol lights painted his face in red and blue. Detective Briggs sat several feet away with both hands trembling against his knees. He looked older suddenly, smaller somehow. Samuel Hayes approached the bench and handed additional documents to the judge, while federal agents quietly positioned themselves near the exits. Assistant District Attorney Bennett loosened his collar and stepped away from the prosecution table entirely, distancing himself from the disaster unfolding around him. "Your Honor," Hayes said calmly, "we are requesting immediate federal custody of all evidence connected to this case, including communication records from involved officers." Judge Whitmore nodded slowly without taking her eyes off Keller. "Granted." One of the federal agents stepped toward Keller then. "Officer Ryan Keller, you are being placed under investigation for evidence tampering, obstruction, and conspiracy related to an ongoing federal operation." Keller finally stood so abruptly his chair scraped harshly across the courtroom floor. "You cannot do this based on one edited clip." "It is not one clip," Naomi said quietly. The room turned toward her again. She walked forward slowly now, no longer hidden behind the defense table. The fluorescent lights overhead reflected softly against the polished floor beneath her feet. Calm, steady, controlled. There are phone records, she continued. Transfer logs, informant payments, missing narcotics inventory tied to multiple arrests over 14 months. Keller stared at her with disbelief twisting across his face. You planned this from the beginning. Naomi shook her head faintly. No, I gave you chances to stop. Briggs lowered his head deeper into his hands. She did, he whispered hoarsely. She warned us that night. Keller looked toward his former partner sharply. You are really turning on me here? Briggs finally looked up, eyes red with exhaustion and regret. You kept saying nobody would care what happened to her. His voice cracked slightly. You said she was invisible. The words settled heavily across the courtroom. Naomi's expression softened for the first time all day, but not with victory. Something sadder than that. The sadness of hearing out loud what she already knew too well. Judge Whitmore removed her glasses slowly. Special Agent Carter, she said carefully. Why continue the operation after realizing your cover was compromised? Naomi glanced briefly toward the courthouse windows where rainwater still traced slow paths down the glass. Because corruption survives when people stop believing the truth matters, she answered softly. And because too many innocent people were already buried under false reports. Silence followed her words. Not forced silence. The kind that reaches people before they know how to respond. Even the reporters stopped typing for a moment. Keller looked around the courtroom then, perhaps expecting someone to defend him, but nobody moved. Not Bennett. Not Briggs. Not the officers near the walls. The same room that once believed him without question now watched him with quiet distance. And for the first time since the arrest, Ryan Keller finally understood what it felt like to stand alone while everyone else decided who you were before you could speak. By the time the hearing finally ended, evening had settled over Baltimore in soft shades of gray and gold. The rain had stopped sometime during the federal testimony, leaving the courthouse windows streaked with fading water that caught the last light of sunset like thin lines of fire. Inside Courtroom 7, people moved more quietly now. Reporters packed away cameras without the loud confidence they arrived with earlier that morning. Deputies carried evidence boxes toward federal agents while courthouse staff whispered carefully to one another near the walls. The energy of scandal had faded. What remained felt heavier than that. More human. Naomi Carter stood near the empty defense table, no longer wearing restraints, her county jacket folded neatly over one arm. Across the room, Ryan Keller sat alone beside two federal investigators, staring blankly at the dark courtroom monitors that had dismantled his career piece by piece. Nobody crowded around him anymore. Nobody called him a hero. The silence surrounding him now looked almost identical to the silence that had surrounded Naomi at the beginning of the day. Only this time the room understood the difference between isolation and innocence. Detective Briggs passed by Naomi slowly while federal agents escorted him toward the hallway. He stopped for just a moment beside her, unable to fully meet her eyes. I should have said something sooner, he admitted quietly. Naomi studied him for a second before answering. Most people wait until fear becomes personal. Briggs nodded once, shame settling across his face like exhaustion. Then he kept walking. Judge Whitmore exited through a side door without ceremony, but not before pausing briefly near Naomi. Agent Carter, she said softly, this court owes you an apology. Naomi's expression remained calm. The court did not arrest me, Your Honor. The judge looked at her carefully then, as if trying to understand how someone could survive humiliation without letting bitterness take root inside them. But Naomi had learned long ago that anger